So I just wanted to start off by mentioning John Lechleiter's presentation that he gave in London last year. John Lechleiter is the CEO of Eli Lilly, and he'll be taking over as president of the IFPMA come October. And essentially what is the current challenge of the pharmaceutical industry that Martin mentioned is that the simplistic approach of applying innovation in a tried and tested manner is coming to an end. The industry is finding that they're taking too long, spending too much money and producing far too little. And another one of our CEOs, who is David Brennan, who's our current president, in a conversation that I had with him, he said he believes that we will look back on this period of time and realize that we were at a crossroads where we have to make a strategic decision as to how we do R&D in the future. So if you think about it, this has strategic health implications for every one of us as we think about how we continue to do R&D. And as Francis so eloquently mentions, the microbes, which I've got one at the moment, very innovative, have a very low cost base. They can use manufacturing capacity and capability without any prior informed consent, and they continue to evolve, continue to innovate, and continue to generate. So there's always that need for further innovation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about when R&D decisions are made, what are the kind of risk factors that we take into account. This year is a small molecule. This year is vancomycin, which is, should have come up on the screen, but it doesn't actually tell you, but that's an alkaloid. That is a naturally recurring product. And the chemical structure here is far more difficult. And just to highlight some of the aspects of natural products is that some of the elements here, we have no idea how they will act in the human body. So the chance then is that we either try to chop them off, which risks destabilizing the whole structure, or we try to nullify the effects, or we try to find a brave, healthy volunteer to see whether or not it does actually do anything adverse in the human body. Whereas over here, this is an antiretroviral. HIV/AIDS is a very complex disease, but the molecules that we can put together to try to attack the different modes of operation of that disease, we can understand. And this is a reverse transcriptase inhibitor that we see on the left-hand side of the screen here. So we're going to have a little look at the two different approaches, and if I was a person in R&D and you're the head of R&D, what might I have to argue to you in order for you to take on my project? And we'll discuss a little bit about how it happens. So as Martin mentioned, you're looking for interesting pharmacological activity. You're looking for targets, so whether it's diabetes, cancer, cardiovascular, maybe you're looking at more the communicable diseases. That is so important that you specify exactly what you think you want your drug to achieve, because that is how the regulatory authority will view your medicine at the end point. And if it doesn't reach that level, then you will not get regulatory, you will get approval. Then you have the safety and efficacy phase that Martin mentioned. Again, it's actually quite interesting how that has evolved. As patients, we are probably rightly demanding safer and more effective medicines. Years ago, there was a realization that, okay, I'm going to have to take a medicine that's going to do some good, but maybe it's going to do some bad. That's become much less acceptable in society these days, and that's reflected in the regulator. And it's interesting that aspirin, that many of us may take, on the same, they used to say aspirin a day keeps the doctor away. You would not get regulatory approval for aspirin if you filed for that today. And there are many medicines that you would not get approval for because the regulatory burden is getting higher. So then you get approval. And the interesting thing about approval is that you may have heard of evergreening. It's not to do with biodiversity. It's actually to do with patent strategies. And we would call it perhaps incremental innovation. And people are concerned that perhaps we're extending patent life by filing for technical contributions. But in actual fact, that's not really the problem for our industry. Because if we prove to the patent examiner that we have a technical contribution, that we feel that there is an inventive step, we get a patent, but that may not still get us regulatory approval. We have to have a significant therapeutic benefit in order for the regulator to approve the medicine to go on the market. Because there's no point in having a patent on a medicine if you can't actually sell it to anybody. And that process is getting ever more stringent, as Martin mentioned. Then, if you're trying to sell your research project to the head of R&D, and you're saying, I want $100,000 to go to the next level, you also have to include what are the risk factors. So how strong is your patent portfolio? Because that defines, if you like, your exclusivity in the marketplace. What are the chances of somebody saying, well, actually, you're infringing our patent, which means that you might lose your product? What are the chances that your patent might be revoked because someone's found some prior art? You also have to detail what is your market potential. What is the risk that in 10, 15 years' time, when you actually get this medicine, somebody says, well, actually, we have a medicine that's more effective. Thank you very much. You've lost everything. And so you have to present this in a very systematic way to your head of R&D, and you're in competition with other R&D cells. And then finally, the process is that you put your money back into the R&D process, hopefully, if you've got a marketable medicine. When you look at natural products, and I stopped doing the animation because it was starting to spin me out a bit, but there are two main new areas of risk that are associated with natural products, which is why legal certainty in natural products is even more important for our industry. And one of them is if you have some interesting pharmacological activity, and there's a lot of interesting natural products out there, you do have to have a sound supply base. Because if you say, well, I've got one supplier, and it happens to be a country that is not politically stable, or is very geographically difficult to get to, landlocked or whatever, that is going to cause you a problem. And often people don't realize that you'd need more than this room full of that genetic material in order to take it to that next stage. You can often, sometimes, and I used to think this when I was in government, that you could take a couple of leaves and that would be enough. Actually, you need vast quantities of that natural resource if you want to take it through the drug development process. And so reliability of supply is absolutely vital. Because as Martin mentioned, natural products by their very nature are very difficult to synthesize. So you want to have more than perhaps one source. And we had, Eli Lilly had an agreement with Cameroon about something that was very interesting, but they said that they had to renew the contract every 2 years. And of course that does cause problems insofar as, governments all around the world are not particularly fast at getting these bureaucratic processes done. And then you have this supply cut. And again, you need reliability of supply for sometimes 10 to 15 years. And so this is how long it takes. You're going to need a huge amount of this material. And it's important at that phase that you have your prior informed consent and all the parties understand what is the rights and obligations of each party. So I might say to Cameroon, I will give you $1 million or $10 million for this amount of material. And Cameroon might say, great. And if I make no product, Cameroon gets the money irrespective. Or the government of Cameroon might say, well, actually, we don't want you to pay up front, but we would like a percentage of your profits should you develop a molecule. And we would like, say, maybe 5%. And so it's very clear up front that if a product is not developed, unfortunately Cameroon gets nothing, but if a product is developed, they get the 5%. And that gives us legal certainty. And that gives us a comfort blanket when we're going through this process. And that's so important for us as an industry. The second side is the safety and efficacy. We've mentioned it's more complex. This is why these two are in bold for natural products. And then you have the patent invalidity that we mentioned, the market potential. But what is a real risk for the industry is if you get biopiracy or misappropriation claims once you've entered the market. And you might think, well, that's of course when perhaps they would arise. And some of them will no doubt be legitimate. But you can imagine that if you're presenting this business case to your head of R&D and saying that our patents can be revoked if somebody, and we'll look at this in a few moments, somebody in the supply chain, whether they did it knowingly or not, we don't know, did not fulfill their CBD obligations. If your patent is revoked, then the entire process comes to an end. And so that's your what's called a critical risk factor, because basically your entire upfront expenditure is completely wasted. Because, as you know, in an invalidated patent, it becomes free technology for anybody to use. So when you're presenting this to an R&D head, you've got to realize that there are people who are working on small molecules who will have these risk factors. Natural product people will have more risk factors that they will have to say. And it's becoming, because industry is going through a period of change, the R&D heads are going for the safer option oftentimes. And so this is why bodies like this are so important in understanding how these decisions are made, because it's a significant shame if all those medicines were not developed because of the legal uncertainty that was created by the international framework. Because what we worry about is that we'll not even get to these phases, that when you go to your head of R&D with the initial phase of asking for funding, the answer will be no. So you'll say, well, we've got interesting pharmacological activity, but that's the end. We have no idea whether or not this will reach the market at some later stage. And so you can have, as again, you've written down your email addresses, so you can have a copy of this slide. And it's just to kind of give you an idea of the competition in the commercial space that happens within companies and the pressures that are experienced in natural products. Now, it is true that a lot of times in natural products, our companies will buy SMEs, who maybe are the ones who do that initial search to find that interesting molecule, that interesting pharmacological activity. And that again is an extra risk factor, because the SMEs, unlike our companies, may not have a fuller understanding of the CBD. There may be somebody in one of those companies that may do something that actually is not fully compliant at some point. And then you've got to think, well, okay, we need to address that, but what is the rights and obligations of the innocent party, the developer who spent all this money to take this through the process? And that's when we have this problem of risk. That if we buy this biotech SME, they don't have the money to go through clinical trials, but we do. We think this is very interesting, but what is the risk that they haven't done due diligence on every single facet that they should have done? Because if this results in patent revocation, we just won't put our venture capital within that company. And I think this is part of the way that industry works in multiple sectors, is to have a firm grasp of the risks before you start. There's always going to be variables, but you need that understanding before you invest. Because if something happens at the end of the process, then that's a problem for us. Now, just talking a little bit about TK, because of course this meeting is focusing on traditional knowledge. And we just want to give you a rather simplistic scenario of some of the policy dilemmas, if you like, that we will all have to work through when coming to agreement on provisions. So we have a TK holder 1, just to say, for example, they're a community living in Alaska, and they have some very interesting TK, and we have a researcher that has a look at that and says, well, can I do some research? No problem. They allow them to do some research. And researcher 1 lives in South Africa, publishes in South Africa. Then on the basis of that research, you actually have 3 different researchers from different parts of the world, all going in 3 different directions, using different pieces of knowledge from different areas, and building up 3 very different research pieces, perhaps 2 of them in medicines, perhaps 1 in cosmetics. And then we have perhaps, and this is very simplistic, but say we could have a biotech company that actually looks at the work of researcher 2 and says, this is very interesting. I can use some of this knowledge with my chemical library, with my database, with my knowledge and understanding, and start to develop something that may be of interest for further development. And then, for example, we may get researcher 5 that looks at researcher 1 and 2 and is going off in a different direction. And all the time, we're talking about a number of years. So these are separated in terms of geographical scope, different parts of the world, we're a global village these days, and in time. And then at the end of the process, we get a large biotech company that says, well, actually, with our knowledge, we can use some of the knowledge of the biotech company that we'll buy out, perhaps, and then we can also use some of the knowledge from researcher 5. Now, if they go away and develop a medicine, the end product may look completely different, or may not contain any elements of the original TK, but it may not have come about if that TK had not been shed in the first place. Very difficult to know. So what are the rights and obligations in this example? And just to add to that, if we get another TK holder that perhaps is in Greenland, another TK holder that's in Iceland, and that TK holder actually, his knowledge is very similar to his knowledge, and they make a claim of misappropriation, what do you think, what might we do in this scenario? And this is where it becomes quite difficult for the industry to really quantify what those risk factors might mean when you're starting to think about venture capital for the expensive clinical trial phase. And this is, if you like, when does that knowledge become public domain? Is it free to use? Or if it's not free to use, what is the rights and obligations of this large company that maybe didn't know anything about Researcher 1 and the contractual agreement that they had in place? What is the rights and obligations of him to TK1 or to TK holder 3? How do you defend yourself? And what are the remedies that could be deployed? And then another concept for traditional knowledge is that you have a traditional knowledge holder, and they hold that knowledge within that community, and they restrict it quite heavily. And completely independently from that community, you get another entity, another company, or it could be a researcher, because researchers are filing patents these days just as much as industry. And they say, well, actually, these two things are very similar. Now, the patent application will very invariably not contain all that TK, but may contain aspects of it. What happens here? Is there rights and obligations from this patent applicant if you can prove that there was no reasonable expectation that he'd have knowledge of that TK? But it's still using TK. But is it from here? How do you work that out? Is there rights and obligations? And similarly, when you look at how the patent system works, and it's by no means a perfect system, but if these two patent applications from different entities are similar to his, what happens is that hopefully if your patent examiner is any good, he'll identify this patent application, and then you can either amend your patent specification so it's a different patent, or you can enter into licensing agreements. So before you start the costly process of R&D, you can start to understand what your risk factors are. But when there's an independent invention, how do you quantify that risk? What are the rights and obligations? And that's something that I think is a key question for our industry. So just to draw our thoughts to a conclusion, I think the larger industries are foursquare behind fulfilling the rights and obligations under the CBD. They absolutely want to comply with prior informed consent, mutual agreed terms, and benefit sharing. And they are more than happy to do that when they are the ones going into the countries and doing the bioprospecting. The difficulty is the reality. The reality is that there's normally many links in the chain before it gets to a large pharmaceutical company that will invest venture capital. And that's when you start to have the complexity of when does this knowledge change? Is it the same? Is it different? And what do you do if there was one link in that chain that didn't do the necessary due diligence? Because that's not really the party that will suffer if it's the large or small company that's developing the product later on in the chain. So I think this is just to give you a little bit of a flavour as to why this idea of legal certainty is so important for our industry, because those natural product researchers who are fully dedicated to taking those products to the market will be asked these exactly the same questions from their head of R&D. And unless they have good answers, the head of R&D will say, we are not funding this. This is too risky. We'll stick to the chemical libraries. Because even though there's big risks here, we understand them more. Natural products may be something that's just a step too far. So we just wanted to give you a little bit of a flavour of what life is like in the R&D space in the industry, and Marcus will come back up to the platform, and then if you've got any questions, then we're more than happy to answer them. Thank you very much for listening.